You know, there is something rather extraordinary happening in our time, though most people walk past it as if it were merely another shadow on the wall. They speak of progress, of civilization advancing, of mankind reaching new heights of understanding. But what I observe, what I have witnessed in the depths of my own soul and in the souls of those who have sat across from me in my study, tells a different story entirely. We are living through something that our ancestors would have recognized immediately, though we have forgotten the language for it. We have become strangers to the very process that once defined what it meant to be fully human. You see, there was a time when people understood that the soul must undergo certain transformations, certain deaths and rebirths, if it is to mature. They called it initiation. They recognized it as sacred. But we, in our modern cleverness, have dismissed such things as primitive superstition. Yet the soul does not care about our dismissals. It continues its ancient work, regardless of whether we acknowledge it or not. And so we find ourselves experiencing something profound, something that shakes the very foundations of who we thought we were, and we have no name for it. We call it crisis. We call it breakdown. We call it madness. But what if I told you that what you are experiencing is actually the most natural thing in the world? What if what you call symptoms are actually signs of the deepest kind of health? I want to speak to you today about awakening. Not the awakening that comes from books or teachings or spiritual practices, though these may play their part. I am speaking of the awakening that comes from within, unbidden and often unwanted. The awakening that arrives like a thief in the night and steals away everything you thought you knew about yourself and the world. This is not comfortable. In fact, it is often terrifying, because to awaken in this sense means to discover that much of what you have taken to be reality is actually a kind of collective dream. And once you begin to see through the dream, you cannot simply close your eyes and return to sleep. Something has shifted permanently. Something has been set in motion that cannot be stopped. Now, I must be very careful here, because there is a great deal of confusion about what spiritual awakening actually means. People imagine it is some kind of blissful state, some permanent condition of peace and enlightenment. They think it means floating above human concerns, transcending ordinary life, becoming somehow superior to those who remain asleep. But this is a fantasy, and a dangerous one at that. True awakening is far more disturbing and far more human than these pleasant fantasies suggest. It is the process by which the unconscious contents of the psyche begin to surface into consciousness. It is what happens when the careful structures we have built to contain our inner world begin to crack and shift. It is the soul's demand that we become who we actually are, rather than who we think we should be. And this process, this breaking open of the familiar world, produces very specific effects in those who undergo it. There are signs, symptoms if you will, that indicate this profound transformation is taking place. But here is what makes this so difficult to recognize. These symptoms often look like problems. They appear to be evidence that something is going wrong rather than profoundly right. The first symptom, and perhaps the most unsettling, is what I have come to call the dissolution of certainty. You know how it feels to be absolutely sure about something, to rest your entire sense of reality on certain unquestioned beliefs? Well, spiritual awakening begins to dissolve these certainties one by one, like salt in water. Suddenly, things you never questioned before become questionable. Ideas that once seemed obviously true begin to feel hollow, even absurd. This is not a gentle process. It can feel like losing your mind, like the ground beneath your feet is turning to quicksand. You may find yourself questioning everything: your career, your relationships, your values, your entire way of life. Nothing seems solid anymore. Nothing can be taken for granted. And this creates a kind of vertigo, a sense that you are falling through space with nothing to catch you. Most people, when this begins to happen, become frightened. They try to grab onto something, anything, to restore their sense of certainty. They may throw themselves into work or relationships or causes with desperate intensity. They may seek out new belief systems or spiritual teachers or philosophies, hoping to find something solid to replace what they have lost. But this is like trying to cure thirst by drinking sand. The dissolution of certainty is not a problem to be solved. It is a doorway to be walked through. You see, what we call certainty is often nothing more than unconsciousness made comfortable. We are certain about things we have never truly examined. We rest our lives on assumptions we inherited from others without ever asking whether these assumptions serve our deepest nature. The dissolution of certainty, uncomfortable as it is, creates the space for genuine knowing to emerge, not the borrowed knowing of others, but the knowing that comes from your own direct encounter with reality. The second symptom follows closely upon the first, and it is what I call the emergence of the observer. As your old certainties begin to crumble, something curious happens. You begin to notice that you are noticing. You become aware that there is something in you that stands apart from your thoughts, your emotions, your reactions. There is a witness, a consciousness, that observes all of these things without being identical to any of them. This is a profound shift. Most people spend their entire lives completely identified with their mental and emotional states. They do not simply have angry thoughts, they are angry. They do not simply experience sadness, they are sad. But as awakening progresses, this identification begins to loosen. You start to see that thoughts are things that come and go in consciousness, like clouds passing through the sky. Emotions are energies that rise and fall, like waves on the ocean. And you, the real you, are something more fundamental than any of these passing phenomena. This emergence of the observer can be disorienting at first. You may feel detached from your own life, as if you are watching a movie of yourself rather than living directly. But this detachment, this capacity to observe without immediately reacting, is actually the beginning of genuine freedom. For the first time, you have space between stimulus and response. You can choose how to respond rather than simply reacting automatically. The third symptom is perhaps the most mysterious and often the most frightening. It is what I call the activation of the unconscious. As consciousness begins to expand, as the observer awakens, the unconscious responds. Contents that have been buried for years, perhaps for decades, begin to surface. Dreams become more vivid and meaningful. Synchronicities multiply. You may find yourself drawn to symbols, myths, or practices that seem to have nothing to do with your rational mind but speak to something deeper. This activation can manifest in many ways. You may experience powerful dreams that feel more real than waking life. You may find yourself noticing patterns and connections that others miss entirely. Numbers may begin to appear repeatedly. Animals may seem to carry messages. Books may fall open to exactly the page you need to read. The boundary between inner and outer reality becomes permeable in ways that rational thought cannot explain. Now, I must emphasize this point because it is crucial. These experiences are not evidence of mental illness or spiritual inflation. They are natural consequences of consciousness beginning to operate at a deeper level. The unconscious is not separate from consciousness. It is the vast foundation upon which consciousness rests. And as consciousness expands, it naturally begins to include more of this previously unconscious material. But here is where many people make a dangerous mistake. They begin to interpret these experiences through the lens of specialness. They believe that because they are having unusual experiences, they must be specially chosen or spiritually advanced. This is a trap, and a seductive one. The ego, threatened by the dissolution of its familiar world, attempts to reassert control by claiming ownership of these transpersonal experiences. The fourth symptom, which often emerges simultaneously with the activation of the unconscious, is what I call the intensification of sensitivity. As consciousness expands, as the protective barriers of unconsciousness begin to thin, you become more sensitive to everything. Colors seem brighter, sounds are more vivid. You may find that you can no longer tolerate certain environments, certain people, certain activities that previously caused you no difficulty. This heightened sensitivity extends far beyond the physical senses. You begin to pick up on emotional currents that others miss entirely. You can sense when someone is lying, not because of what they say, but because of something in their energy that feels false. You may find yourself knowing things about people that they have not told you, understanding situations in ways that go beyond logical analysis. This can be overwhelming. The world, which once felt manageable and predictable, suddenly becomes a flood of information and sensation. You may feel like a person who has lived their entire life in a soundproof room and suddenly finds themselves in the middle of a symphony. Every note is clear, every instrument distinct, but the sheer volume of information can be paralyzing. Many people, when this sensitivity emerges, try to shut it down. They may withdraw from social situations, avoid crowds, or seek refuge in routine and familiarity. And while some degree of protection is necessary, complete withdrawal is not the answer. This sensitivity is not a burden to be endured, but a capacity to be developed. It is your psyche learning to operate at a more refined frequency, becoming capable of perceiving dimensions of reality that were previously invisible. The fifth symptom, and one that causes tremendous confusion, is what I call the paradox of isolation and connection. As awakening progresses, you may find yourself feeling simultaneously more alone and more connected than you have ever felt before. On one hand, you may feel isolated from those around you who do not seem to be going through this process. Their concerns may seem trivial, their conversations shallow. You may feel like you are speaking a different language, living in a different world, but at the same time, you may feel a profound sense of connection to something much larger than yourself. You may experience moments of unity with nature, with the cosmos, with the very fabric of existence. You may feel the suffering of others as if it were your own, not because you are taking on their pain, but because you are beginning to recognize that the boundaries between self and other are not as solid as you once believed. This paradox can be deeply confusing. How can you feel more alone and more connected simultaneously? The answer lies in understanding that what is dying and what is being born are operating at different levels. The ego, the small sense of self that depends on external validation and familiar relationships, may indeed feel isolated as it discovers that it can no longer relate to the world in the old ways. But the deeper self, the transpersonal dimension of your being, is awakening to its fundamental interconnection with all of life. This paradox reveals something profound about the nature of awakening itself. It is not a movement towards some final destination, some state of permanent enlightenment. Rather, it is a continuous process of dying and being reborn, of losing what you thought you were in order to discover what you actually are. And this process, I must tell you, never truly ends. It simply deepens, layer after layer, year after year, until you begin to understand that the journey itself is the destination. The sixth symptom is what I have observed to be the collapse of linear time. Those undergoing spiritual awakening often report a strange relationship with time itself. Past, present, and future begin to blur together in ways that rational thought cannot accommodate. You may find yourself remembering things that have not yet happened, or experiencing the past as if it were occurring right now. Dreams may feel like memories, and memories may feel like dreams. This is not madness, though it may feel like it. What is happening is that consciousness is beginning to operate according to its own laws rather than the artificial constructs we have imposed upon it. The psyche does not experience time the way a clock does. In the depths of the unconscious, all moments exist simultaneously. Past traumas live alongside future possibilities. Childhood wounds coexist with adult wisdom. The awakening soul begins to access this timeless dimension of experience. I have seen people become deeply disturbed by this phenomenon. They worry that they are losing their grip on reality. But what they are actually losing is their grip on a very limited version of reality, one that insists time must move in straight lines and that cause must always precede effect. The deeper reality, the reality that mystics and poets have always known, operates according to different principles entirely. The seventh symptom manifests as what I call the hunger for meaning. As the old certainties dissolve and consciousness expands, there arises an almost desperate need to understand why. Why am I here? What is the purpose of my existence? What does it all mean? This is not the casual philosophical wandering of youth. This is a burning question that demands an answer, a thirst that ordinary pleasures and achievements can no longer satisfy. This hunger can become consuming. You may find yourself reading voraciously, searching through philosophy and psychology and religion for some framework that can contain your expanding experience. You may seek out teachers or guides or communities of like-minded seekers. There's nothing wrong with this searching, but there is a danger in it as well. The danger is that you may mistake the map for the territory, the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself. The meaning you seek cannot be found in books or teachings, though these may point you in the right direction. It can only be discovered through your own direct encounter with the depths of your being, and paradoxically, the more desperately you search for it, the more elusive it becomes. Meaning, real meaning, emerges not from seeking but from being. It arises naturally when you stop trying to impose significance on your experience and simply allow your experience to reveal its own significance. The eighth symptom is perhaps the most challenging of all, and it is what I call the dissolution of the persona. The persona, you understand, is the mask we wear in the world, the role we play in society. It is necessary for functioning in the collective, but it is not who we actually are. It is a compromise between our true nature and the demands of the external world. During spiritual awakening, this mask begins to crack and crumble. You may find that you can no longer perform the role that others expect of you. The successful businessman discovers he has no interest in business. The devoted wife finds herself questioning the very institution of marriage. The loyal citizen begins to see through the stories his society tells about itself. This dissolution can be terrifying because the persona has provided not just social function but identity itself. When it begins to fall away, you may feel as though you are disappearing entirely. Who are you if not the role you play? What is left when the mask is removed? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones. Because beneath the persona lies something far more authentic and far more alive than any role could ever be. The ninth symptom emerges as what I have come to understand as the activation of the shadow. As consciousness expands and the persona begins to dissolve, you inevitably encounter those aspects of yourself that you have spent your life trying to hide or deny. Every quality you have rejected in yourself, every impulse you have suppressed, every part of your nature that you have deemed unacceptable begins to surface with undeniable force. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of spiritual awakening because it shatters our carefully constructed self-image. We like to think of ourselves as good people, as evolved beings, as spiritually advanced souls. But the shadow does not care about these pleasant fictions. It presents us with our capacity for cruelty, our hidden selfishness, our repressed anger and sexuality and greed. It shows us that we are not the pure beings we imagined ourselves to be. Most people, when they encounter their shadow, recoil in horror. They try to push these unwanted aspects back into the darkness where they came from. But this is impossible once they have been seen, and the attempt only gives them more power. The shadow that is fought becomes the shadow that controls. The only way through this encounter is acceptance, not of the shadow's dominion, but of its existence as part of the totality of who you are. The 10th and final symptom I will share with you today is what I call the birth of compassion. As you move through these previous 9 stages, as you encounter the dissolution of certainty and the emergence of the observer, as you navigate the activation of the unconscious and the intensification of sensitivity, as you experience the paradox of isolation and connection and the collapse of linear time, as you grapple with the hunger for meaning and the dissolution of the persona and the activation of the shadow, something remarkable begins to happen. You begin to see that everyone is struggling with these same fundamental challenges. The businessman who seems so confident is wrestling with his own dissolution of certainty. The housewife who appears so content is navigating her own encounter with the shadow. The politician who speaks so authoritatively is grappling with his own hunger for meaning. Everyone, absolutely everyone, is fighting the same basic battle between who they think they should be and who they actually are. This recognition gives birth to a compassion that has nothing to do with pity or superiority. It is a compassion born of understanding, of recognizing yourself in every other struggling human being. You see that we are all walking each other home, all trying to find our way back to some fundamental truth about what it means to be alive. And in this seeing, in this recognition of our shared predicament, the isolation that marked the earlier stages of awakening begins to transform into a profound sense of kinship with all of life. But here I must offer a word of caution, for this compassion can become yet another trap if it is not held with wisdom. There is a tendency, especially among those who are spiritually awakening, to believe that they must save everyone, that they must help all beings achieve the same level of consciousness they have attained. This is spiritual pride disguised as love, and it serves no one. True compassion understands that each soul must walk its own path, must encounter its own darkness, must find its own way to the light. Your role is not to awaken others, but to remain awake yourself, not to fix the world, but to embody the change you wish to see, not to eliminate suffering, but to transform your own relationship to it so completely that you become a living demonstration of another way to be. These 10 symptoms, then, are not problems to be solved, but stages to be lived through. They are not evidence that something is wrong with you, but signs that something profoundly right is taking place. They are the natural consequences of consciousness, expanding beyond the narrow confines in which it has been contained, of the soul insisting on its own authentic expression, of life demanding that you become who you were always meant to be. The process is not easy. It requires tremendous courage to let go of everything familiar, to walk into the unknown with no guarantee of what you will find there. It demands a willingness to be broken open, to have your comfortable illusions shattered, to face aspects of yourself and of existence that you would prefer to avoid. But the alternative is to remain asleep, to live your entire life as a shadow of your true potential, to die never having truly lived. And so we find ourselves at a curious juncture, you and I. Perhaps you recognize yourself in what I have described. Perhaps these symptoms I have outlined feel uncomfortably familiar, like looking into a mirror you did not know existed. Or perhaps you find yourself thinking of someone you know, someone who has been exhibiting these very signs, and you have been wondering what is wrong with them. But here is what I must tell you, and I speak from the depths of my own experience, from years of sitting with my own darkness and emerging into something I could never have imagined. There is nothing wrong. There is nothing broken. There is nothing that needs to be fixed or cured or medicated away. What you are witnessing, what you may be experiencing yourself, is the soul's insistence on its own authentic expression. You see, we have been taught to fear these symptoms. Our modern world has no place for the dissolution of certainty. It demands that we remain productive, predictable, manageable. It insists that we maintain our personas, that we keep our shadows hidden, that we suppress any experience that cannot be easily categorized and controlled. And so, when the awakening begins, when these ancient processes start to unfold, we are told we are having a breakdown rather than a breakthrough. But I want to suggest something quite different to you. What if these symptoms are not signs of pathology but of profound health? What if they indicate not that something is going wrong but that something is finally going right? What if the soul, after years or decades of being compressed into forms that do not fit, is finally insisting on its own truth? I have watched this process unfold countless times, both in my own psyche and in those who have trusted me with their deepest struggles. And what I have observed is this: those who resist these symptoms, who try to push them away or medicate them into silence, remain stuck in patterns that slowly drain the life from them. But those who learn to work with these symptoms, to understand them as allies rather than enemies, discover depths of themselves they never knew existed. The 11th symptom, which often emerges as the others begin to integrate, is what I have come to recognize as the development of symbolic thinking. The rational mind, you understand, operates through linear logic, through cause and effect, through categories and definitions. But as consciousness expands, another way of knowing begins to emerge. You start to think in images, in metaphors, in symbols that carry multiple layers of meaning simultaneously. This is not a regression to primitive thinking, though it may appear so to those who worship only at the altar of rationality. This is actually a more sophisticated form of consciousness, one that can hold paradox and ambiguity, one that recognizes that truth often comes disguised in forms that logic cannot penetrate. The dream that reveals the solution to a problem you have been wrestling with for months. The chance encounter that shifts the entire direction of your life. The book that falls open to exactly the passage you need to read. These are not coincidences. They are the universe speaking in its native tongue, which is the language of symbol and synchronicity. And as you awaken, you begin to understand this language with increasing fluency. You start to read the signs and omens that surround you constantly, to recognize the patterns that connect seemingly unrelated events, to trust the wisdom that comes not through thinking, but through direct knowing. The 12th symptom manifests as what I call the hunger for solitude. Not the loneliness of isolation, you understand, but the deep need to be alone with yourself, to sit in the silence and discover what emerges when all the external voices fall away. This hunger often frightens people because our culture has convinced us that solitude is somehow pathological, that healthy people are always social, always connected, always engaged with others. But the awakening soul requires solitude, like a plant requires darkness to develop its roots. In the quiet spaces, away from the demands and expectations of others, you can finally hear your own voice. Not the voice that has been conditioned by family and society and culture, but the voice that emerges from your deepest nature, the voice that knows things your conscious mind has never learned. I remember my own period of profound solitude, when I withdrew from the world for months at a time, when I could barely tolerate the company of others because their unconsciousness felt like a physical weight upon my soul. My colleagues thought I was having a nervous breakdown. My family worried that I had lost my mind. But I knew with a certainty that went beyond rational understanding that this withdrawal was necessary, that something was gestating in the depths of my being that required protection and silence to emerge. And what emerged was not madness, but a profound sanity, not breakdown, but breakthrough. In that solitude, I encountered aspects of myself I had never known existed. I met figures from my own unconscious who became my teachers and guides. I discovered capacities for understanding and creativity that I could never have accessed while maintaining my ordinary social persona. The 13th symptom reveals itself as the emergence of what I call the wounded healer. As you move through the process of awakening, as you encounter your own darkness and begin to integrate it, you develop a capacity to help others that comes not from theory or technique, but from your own lived experience of transformation. You become someone who can sit with another person's pain without trying to fix it, without offering false comfort, without turning away from the darkness. This is a profound shift, because most people, when confronted with suffering, either try to make it go away or they become overwhelmed by it themselves. But the wounded healer has learned to hold space for pain without being destroyed by it. They have discovered that suffering, when met with consciousness rather than resistance, has the power to transform both the one who suffers and the one who witnesses. But here is the paradox. You cannot set out to become a wounded healer. It is not a career choice or a spiritual identity you can adopt. It emerges naturally from your own journey through the darkness, from your own encounter with the parts of yourself you would rather not face. The healing you offer others is simply the overflow of your own healing. The wisdom you share is simply what you have learned in the crucible of your own transformation. The 14th symptom appears as what I have observed to be the dissolution of the victim narrative. This is perhaps one of the most liberating and simultaneously terrifying aspects of spiritual awakening. As consciousness expands, as you begin to see the deeper patterns that govern your life, you can no longer maintain the comfortable fiction that you are simply a victim of circumstances beyond your control. This does not mean that terrible things have not happened to you. It does not mean that you have not been genuinely wounded by others. But it does mean that you begin to see how your own unconscious patterns have attracted certain experiences, how your own unhealed wounds have drawn particular people and situations into your life. You start to understand that you are not just the victim of your story, but also its author, not just the sufferer, but also the creator of your own suffering. This recognition can be devastating because it strips away the last refuge of the ego, which is always looking for someone or something to blame. But it is also incredibly empowering because it means that if you have been the unconscious author of your own suffering, you can become the conscious author of your own healing and transformation. The 15th symptom manifests as the awakening of what I call prophetic consciousness. I do not mean the ability to predict the future in any literal sense. I mean the capacity to see the deeper currents that move beneath the surface of events, to recognize the archetypal patterns that repeat themselves throughout history, to sense where the collective is heading before it knows itself. This prophetic awareness often emerges as a deep concern for the world, a sense that humanity is at a crossroads, that we are collectively undergoing the same process of death and rebirth that you are experiencing individually. You may find yourself seeing through the facades that society presents, recognizing the shadow that lurks behind our collective pretensions, understanding that the external crises we face are reflections of the internal crises we refuse to acknowledge. This can be a heavy burden to carry because you see things that others do not want to see. You understand truths that others find too disturbing to contemplate. But it is also a sacred responsibility because those who can see clearly have an obligation to bear witness, to speak truth, even when it is unwelcome, to hold space for the transformation that must come. The 16th symptom reveals itself as what I have come to understand as the integration of opposites. Throughout your life, you have been taught to divide the world into categories: good and bad, right and wrong, sacred and profane, masculine and feminine, light and dark. But as awakening progresses, these rigid distinctions begin to blur and merge. You start to see that what you call good often contains the seeds of evil, that what you condemn as wrong may serve a purpose you do not understand, that the sacred and profane are different faces of the same mystery. You begin to recognize that the masculine and feminine exist within every soul, that light and darkness are both necessary for wholeness, that life itself emerges from the tension between opposing forces. This integration is not about moral relativism or the abandonment of all ethical standards. It is about developing a more sophisticated understanding of the complexity of existence, a recognition that truth often lies not in choosing one side over another, but in finding the dynamic balance between apparent opposites. The 17th symptom emerges as what I call the activation of ancestral wisdom. As consciousness expands beyond the narrow confines of the personal ego, you may find yourself accessing knowledge and understanding that seems to come from sources beyond your own experience. You may dream of ancestors you never knew, receive guidance from figures who seem to exist outside of time, find yourself knowing things that you have never learned. This is not fantasy or wishful thinking. This is consciousness, connecting with the deeper layers of the psyche where the wisdom of the ages is stored, where the accumulated experience of humanity lives as living presence rather than dead memory. You are tapping into what I have called the collective unconscious, that vast repository of archetypal wisdom that belongs not to any individual but to the species itself. The 18th symptom manifests as the emergence of what I have observed to be sacred sexuality. As the awakening process unfolds, as you begin to integrate the shadow and heal the split between mind and body, your relationship to your own sexuality undergoes a profound transformation. What was once driven by unconscious compulsions or repressed through shame becomes a conscious expression of your deepest nature. This sacred sexuality has nothing to do with promiscuity or libertinism. It is about recognizing the sexual energy as one of the most powerful creative forces available to human beings, understanding that it can be channeled not just into physical reproduction, but into spiritual creation, into the birth of new consciousness, into the manifestation of beauty and meaning in the world. The 19th symptom appears as what I call the death of the future. This may sound ominous, but it is actually profoundly liberating. As awakening deepens, you begin to lose interest in the future as you once conceived it. The goals and ambitions that once drove you, the plans and dreams that once seemed so important, begin to feel hollow and irrelevant. This is not depression or despair. This is the recognition that the future you were chasing was based on who you thought you were, not who you actually are. As your true nature emerges, as you discover depths of yourself you never knew existed, the future naturally reorganizes itself around this new understanding. You stop trying to become someone and start being who you are. The 20th and final symptom I will share with you is perhaps the most mysterious of all. It is what I have come to call the return to innocence. After all the darkness you have faced, all the illusions you have lost, all the certainties that have crumbled, something remarkable happens. You begin to see the world with fresh eyes, as if you were seeing it for the first time. But this is not the innocence of ignorance or naivety. This is the innocence that comes from having seen through the game, from having faced the darkness and emerged intact, from having discovered that beneath all the complexity and confusion and suffering lies something indestructible and pure. You return to a state of wonder and curiosity and openness, but now it is grounded in wisdom rather than ignorance. This return to innocence is perhaps the greatest gift of the awakening process, because it allows you to engage with life fully once again, to find joy and meaning and beauty, even in the midst of a world that often seems dark and broken. You have seen through the illusions, but you have also seen through to what lies beneath them, and what you have found there is not emptiness but fullness, not meaninglessness but meaning so profound it cannot be spoken. And so we come to understand that these 20 symptoms are not separate phenomena but aspects of a single great transformation, facets of the diamond of awakening consciousness. They may appear in different orders, with different intensities, over different periods of time. Some may be subtle whispers, others overwhelming storms. But they are all part of the same fundamental process by which the soul insists on its own authentic expression. If you recognize these symptoms in yourself, do not be afraid. Do not try to make them go away. Do not medicate them or therapy them or spiritualize them out of existence. Instead, learn to work with them as you would work with a river, not by trying to stop its flow, but by learning to navigate its currents, to understand its rhythms, to trust its ultimate direction toward the sea. For this is what spiritual awakening truly is: not an achievement or an attainment, but a returning, not a becoming, but a remembering, not a reaching toward something new, but a recognition of what has always been present, waiting patiently for you to stop running and turn toward home. The 21st symptom, and one that often brings the greatest confusion, is what I have observed to be the dissolution of the need for external validation. You see, throughout your life, you have been trained like a dog to seek approval, to look to others for confirmation that you are good, that you are worthy, that you exist at all in any meaningful way. But as awakening deepens, this desperate hunger for recognition begins to fade like morning mist before the sun. This is not indifference, you understand. This is not the coldness of someone who has given up on human connection. This is something far more profound. It is the recognition that the approval you have been seeking from others was always a pale reflection of the approval you needed to give yourself. And more than that, it is the understanding that your worth does not depend on anyone's opinion, including your own. I remember the moment when this realization struck me with full force. I was sitting in my study, reading a particularly harsh critique of my work, and I waited for the familiar stab of hurt, the defensive anger, the need to justify myself. But nothing came. Instead, there was a curious emptiness, not the emptiness of loss, but the emptiness of space, of freedom. I realized that the person writing those words was writing about someone I no longer was, someone I had perhaps never truly been. This dissolution can be terrifying for those around you because they have become accustomed to being able to manipulate you through praise and blame. Suddenly their weapons no longer work. Your mother's disapproval, which once could send you into days of self-doubt, rolls off you like water off stone. Your colleagues' praise, which once filled you with temporary satisfaction, feels hollow and irrelevant. You are no longer dancing to their tune because you can no longer hear the music. The 22nd symptom manifests as what I call the emergence of natural authority. This has nothing to do with dominating others or seeking power over them. Natural authority arises when you stop trying to convince anyone of anything, when you stop defending your position or attacking theirs, when you simply stand in your truth without apology or explanation. People sense this immediately, though they may not understand what they are sensing. There is something about a person who no longer needs to be right, who no longer requires others to agree with them, who has found their center and stands there quietly. It creates a kind of gravitational field. Others are drawn to it, even when they do not know why. But here is the paradox. The moment you try to cultivate this authority, the moment you attempt to manufacture this presence, it disappears entirely. It can only arise naturally from the depth of your own integration, from having faced your shadow so completely that you no longer project it onto others, from having found your authentic self so thoroughly that you no longer need to perform for anyone. The 23rd symptom reveals itself as the activation of what I have come to understand as cellular memory. As consciousness expands beyond the confines of the personal mind, you may begin to experience memories that do not belong to your current lifetime. These are not fantasies or wishful thinking. They are the memories stored in the very cells of your body, the ancestral experiences that have shaped your physical form and your instinctual responses. You may find yourself knowing how to do things you have never learned, feeling drawn to places you have never been, understanding languages that were never taught to you. This is your body remembering what your mind has forgotten, your cells awakening to the vast repository of experience they carry within their molecular structure. I have witnessed people suddenly able to paint in styles they had never studied, to speak in dialects they had never heard, to perform rituals they had never been taught. The rational mind recoils from such phenomena, dismissing them as imagination or fraud. But the awakening consciousness recognizes them as evidence of the profound interconnectedness of all life, the way each individual carries within themselves the history of the entire species. The 24th symptom appears as what I call the death of the victim and the birth of the creator. This is perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of spiritual awakening because it completely transforms your relationship to your own life story. You begin to see that every experience you have had, every person you have encountered, every challenge you have faced has been perfectly designed to bring you to this moment of awakening. This does not mean that suffering is good or that abuse is justified. It means that consciousness has the remarkable ability to transform even the most terrible experiences into wisdom, even the deepest wounds into sources of strength. You stop asking why these things happen to you and start asking what they have taught you, what gifts they have hidden within their darkness. I think of my own descent into what others called madness. Those years when I was lost in visions and voices, when I could barely function in the ordinary world. At the time it felt like pure suffering, like a curse that had fallen upon me for no reason. But now I see that it was the most necessary experience of my life, the crucible in which my understanding of the human psyche was forged. The victim sees only the pain. The creator sees the purpose. And in that shift of perception, everything changes. Your entire history becomes not a burden to carry, but a treasure to mine. Not evidence of your brokenness, but proof of your resilience. Not reasons for despair, but foundations for wisdom. The 25th symptom manifests as the emergence of what I have observed to be prophetic dreams. As the boundary between conscious and unconscious becomes more permeable, your dreams begin to carry information that transcends the personal realm. You may dream of events before they occur, receive guidance about decisions you have not yet made, encounter figures who provide wisdom you could not have generated from your own limited experience. These dreams have a quality that distinguishes them from ordinary dreams. They are more vivid, more coherent, more memorable. They often come with a sense of absolute certainty, an inner knowing that what you have experienced is not mere fantasy but revelation. The images may be symbolic, requiring interpretation, but the essential message is unmistakable. I have learned to pay careful attention to such dreams, to record them immediately upon waking, to sit with them until their meaning becomes clear. They have guided me through the most difficult periods of my life, warned me of dangers I could not have anticipated, shown me paths I would never have discovered through rational planning alone. The 26th symptom reveals itself as what I call the dissolution of the need to understand. Throughout your life, you have been driven by the desire to figure things out, to make sense of your experience, to find explanations for everything that happens to you. But as awakening deepens, this compulsive need to understand begins to relax into something far more peaceful. You begin to recognize that there are mysteries that are meant to remain mysterious, truths that can only be lived rather than comprehended, experiences that lose their power the moment you try to capture them in concepts. You learn to rest in the not knowing, to find peace in the questions rather than desperately seeking answers. This is not intellectual laziness or spiritual bypassing. This is the wisdom that comes from recognizing the limitations of the rational mind, understanding that consciousness is far vaster than thought, that reality is far more complex than any explanation could contain. You stop trying to solve the puzzle of existence and start learning to dance with its mystery. The 27th symptom appears as the activation of what I have come to understand as the healing presence. As you integrate your own shadow and make peace with your own darkness, you develop the capacity to hold space for others in their darkest moments without being overwhelmed or depleted. You become someone who can sit with pain without trying to fix it, who can witness suffering without adding to it. This healing presence has nothing to do with technique or training. It emerges naturally from your own journey through the underworld, from your own encounter with the parts of yourself you would rather not face. The compassion you offer is not sentimental pity, but the deep recognition that we are all walking each other home, all trying to find our way through the same fundamental darkness. People sense this presence immediately. They find themselves telling you things they have never told anyone, sharing secrets they have carried for years, allowing themselves to be vulnerable in ways that surprise even them. And in that vulnerability, in that willingness to be seen completely, healing begins to occur naturally. The 28th symptom manifests as what I call the return of the sacred feminine. I do not mean this in any political or ideological sense. I am speaking of the restoration of the receptive, intuitive, creative principle that has been suppressed in our rationalistic age. As awakening progresses, you begin to trust the wisdom of the body, the intelligence of the heart, the knowing that comes through feeling rather than thinking. This sacred feminine manifests differently in men and women, but it manifests in everyone who undergoes genuine awakening. In men, it often appears as a softening, a willingness to be vulnerable, an opening to the emotional and intuitive dimensions of experience they have been taught to suppress. In women, it may manifest as a reclaiming of their own inner authority, a trust in their intuitive wisdom, a refusal to diminish themselves to make others comfortable. The sacred feminine is the principle that knows without needing to know how it knows, that creates without needing to understand the process of creation, that loves without requiring reasons for loving. It is the wisdom of the earth, the intelligence of the womb, the knowing that emerges from the depths of being rather than the surfaces of thought. The 29th symptom reveals itself as the emergence of what I have observed to be timeline healing. As consciousness expands beyond the linear conception of time, you begin to understand that all moments exist simultaneously in the eternal now. Past traumas are not fixed events that happened once and continue to wound you. They are living experiences that can be healed retroactively through present moment awareness. This is not magical thinking or wishful fantasy. This is the recognition that trauma exists not in the past, but in your present relationship to the past. When that relationship changes, when you can hold those difficult experiences with compassion rather than resistance, the entire timeline shifts. The wound that has been bleeding for decades can finally begin to heal. I have witnessed people experience profound healing of childhood traumas, not by reliving them or analyzing them endlessly, but by bringing present moment consciousness to bear on the pain that still lives in their body. The child who was hurt is not gone, lost in some distant past. That child exists now, in this moment, and can receive now the love and understanding they needed then. The 30th and final symptom I will share with you is perhaps the most mysterious and beautiful of all. It is what I call the recognition of the eternal self. After all the dissolution and reconstruction, after all the death and rebirth, after all the symptoms have been experienced and integrated, you come to understand that there is something in you that has never been born and can never die. This is not a belief or a concept or a hope. This is direct knowing, immediate recognition of your own immortal nature. You see that all the drama of your personal life, all the suffering and joy, all the growth and change has been happening to something that remains fundamentally untouched by any of it. Like waves on the ocean, your experiences arise and pass away, but the ocean itself remains eternally present, eternally peaceful, eternally whole. This recognition brings with it a profound relaxation, a deep exhale that seems to have been held for lifetimes. You no longer need to protect yourself because you realize there is nothing that can ultimately harm you. You no longer need to improve yourself because you understand that your essential nature is already perfect. You no longer need to achieve anything because you recognize that what you have been seeking has been present all along, waiting patiently for you to stop searching and simply be. And yet, paradoxically, this recognition does not lead to withdrawal from life, but to deeper engagement with it. When you know yourself as the eternal consciousness in which all experiences arise, you can participate fully in the human drama without being destroyed by it. You can love completely without fear of loss, give generously without fear of depletion, create boldly without attachment to outcomes. This is the ultimate fruit of spiritual awakening, not escape from the human condition, but the complete embrace of it from a place of unshakable inner freedom. You become fully human and fully divine simultaneously, no longer torn between earth and heaven, but recognizing them as two faces of the same mystery. These 30 symptoms, then, are not separate phenomena, but aspects of a single great awakening, movements in the symphony of consciousness, returning to itself. They may appear gradually or suddenly, gently or dramatically, but they all point toward the same fundamental recognition that you are not who you thought you were, that reality is not what it appears to be, that existence itself is far more magical and meaningful than the rational mind could ever comprehend. If you find yourself experiencing these symptoms, know that you are not alone. Know that you are not going crazy. Know that what feels like breakdown is actually breakthrough. What seems like ending is actually beginning. What appears to be death is actually birth into a larger life than you ever imagined possible. The process is not comfortable. It requires everything you think you are to die so that what you actually are can be born. It demands that you surrender every false identity, every limiting belief, every comfortable illusion. But what emerges from this great dying is something so beautiful, so authentic, so alive, that you wonder how you ever lived any other way. This is the great work of our time, not just for individuals, but for humanity as a whole. We are all undergoing this collective awakening, this species-wide initiation into a new level of consciousness. Some are further along in the process than others, but we are all part of the same great transformation. And so I leave you with this understanding. Trust the process. Trust the symptoms. Trust the dissolution and the reconstruction, the darkness and the light, the questions and the silence that follows them. You are being midwifed into a new way of being, and though the birth may be difficult, what is being born is nothing less than your authentic self, your eternal nature, your true face, before you were born and after you die. This is what it means to awaken, not to achieve some special state or gain some supernatural power, but simply to remember what you have always been beneath all the layers of conditioning and confusion. You are consciousness itself, appearing as a human being for the sheer joy of experiencing existence from this particular perspective. Never forget this. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. You are the universe awakening to itself, and that awakening is the most natural thing in the world. You see, there is something profoundly curious about the human mind when it begins to recognize itself. It is like watching a sleepwalker slowly open their eyes while still in motion, still caught between the dream world and the waking world, uncertain which reality is more real. I have spent countless hours in my consulting room, watching as people discover that the voice they have been listening to their entire lives, the voice they believed was their own, was actually a chorus of others speaking through them. Their parents, their teachers, their society, all taking turns at the podium of consciousness while the authentic self sits silent in the audience, waiting for its moment to speak. The 31st symptom, and one that brings tremendous relief when it is finally recognized, is what I have come to understand as the death of the inner critic. You know this voice well, do you not? The one that comments on everything you do, judges every thought you think, finds fault with every choice you make. It masquerades as wisdom, as self-improvement, as the voice of reason, but it is none of these things. This critic is actually the internalized voice of every person who ever told you that you were not enough, not right, not acceptable as you are. It is the accumulated judgment of a lifetime compressed into a single, relentless commentator that follows you everywhere you go. And for most people, this voice becomes so familiar that they mistake it for their own thinking, their own conscience, their own inner guidance. But as awakening deepens, something remarkable occurs. You begin to recognize this voice as foreign, as something that does not belong to you. You start to hear the different tones within it, the way it sometimes sounds like your mother when she was disappointed, your father when he was angry, your teachers when they were correcting you. And in that recognition, its power begins to weaken. The moment you can step back and observe the critic, rather than being consumed by it, you have taken the first step toward freedom. Because what you observe, you are not. The part of you that can watch the critic at work is larger than the critic itself, more fundamental, more true. And from this place of observation, you can begin to question whether this voice serves you or enslaves you. I remember my own liberation from this inner tyrant. For years, it had convinced me that I was not a real scientist, not a legitimate scholar, not worthy of the positions I held. Every achievement was dismissed as luck or accident, every recognition as undeserved. The voice was so constant, so convincing, that I had accepted it as the truth about myself. But one day, sitting in my study, I heard it with fresh ears. And suddenly I could hear my old professor's disapproval, my colleagues' skepticism, my own father's doubt about my unconventional path. These voices had taken up residence in my mind and had been speaking as if they were me. The relief of recognizing this deception was like removing a heavy coat I had not realized I was wearing. The 30-second symptom manifests as what I call the emergence of the authentic voice. When the critic falls silent, when the chorus of others finally stops performing in your inner theater, something extraordinary happens. A voice emerges that you may not have heard since childhood, a voice that speaks with clarity and simplicity and truth. This voice does not judge or analyze or compare. It simply knows. It knows what feels right and what feels wrong, what serves life and what serves death, what brings you closer to your true nature and what pulls you away from it. This is not the voice of opinion or preference, but of deep instinctual wisdom, the voice of the self that has been waiting patiently beneath all the noise. When this voice speaks, it often surprises you. It may tell you to leave a career you have spent years building, to end a relationship you thought was permanent, to move to a place you have never been. Its guidance may seem impractical or even dangerous to the rational mind, but there is something about its quality, its certainty, its peace that lets you know it can be trusted. This authentic voice speaks in your own rhythm, uses your own words, carries your own essence. It is not trying to impress anyone or prove anything. It simply expresses what is true for you in this moment, what your deepest self knows to be right. And the more you listen to it, the stronger and clearer it becomes. The 33rd symptom reveals itself as the dissolution of the need to be understood. Throughout your life, you have exhausted yourself trying to explain yourself to others, trying to make them see what you see, feel what you feel, understand why you make the choices you make. You have twisted yourself into impossible shapes, diluted your truth, compromised your vision, all in the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would truly understand you. But as awakening progresses, this need begins to fade like morning fog. You realize that your experience is your own, that your truth does not require anyone else's validation, that being understood is a luxury, not a necessity. you stop explaining yourself, stop defending your choices, stop trying to convince others of your perspective. This does not mean you become cold or indifferent. You simply recognize that understanding is a gift that cannot be demanded, only offered and received freely. Some people will understand you naturally, without explanation. Others will never understand you, no matter how clearly you speak. And both are perfectly acceptable. I have learned to rest in this not being understood, to find peace in the fact that my deepest experiences cannot be translated into words that satisfy everyone. There is something sacred about the mysteries that live within us, something that should not be reduced to explanations that fit into other people's frameworks. Some things are meant to remain mysterious, known only to the one who lives them. The 34th symptom appears as what I have observed to be the activation of cellular wisdom. Your body, you see, carries intelligence that your mind has barely begun to comprehend. Every cell contains not just the information needed for physical function, but the accumulated wisdom of countless generations, the memory of every adaptation your ancestors made to survive and thrive. As consciousness expands, you begin to access this cellular intelligence directly. Your body starts to guide you in ways that bypass rational thought entirely. You find yourself drawn to certain foods without knowing why, repelled by others that you once enjoyed. You develop an uncanny sense of which people are safe and which are dangerous, which environments nourish you and which drain you. This is not superstition or imagination. This is your body's ancient wisdom system coming online, the same system that guides animals in their migrations, plants in their growth toward light, the same system that has kept life alive on this planet for millions of years. Your rational mind may not understand its logic, but your body knows things your mind has never learned. I have learned to trust this cellular wisdom even when it contradicts my mental preferences. When my body says rest, I rest, even if my schedule says work. When my body says move, I move, even if my mind says stay. This is not about becoming a slave to physical impulses, but about recognizing that the body contains intelligence that complements and sometimes surpasses mental intelligence. The 35th symptom manifests as the emergence of what I call the capacity for conscious suffering. This may sound like a contradiction, for who would choose to suffer consciously? But there is a profound difference between the unconscious suffering that destroys and the conscious suffering that transforms. And so we arrive at the end of our journey together, though endings, like beginnings, are merely illusions of the linear mind. What I have shared with you today are not symptoms to be diagnosed or cured, but recognitions to be welcomed, like old friends returning home after a long absence. Each one a doorway, each one an invitation to remember what you have always known, but somehow forgot in the noise of becoming someone else's idea of who you should be. If you have recognized yourself in these words, if something within you has stirred in response to this naming of the unnamed, then you are already further along the path than you know. The very fact that you can see these symptoms, can feel their truth resonating in the chambers of your own experience, means that the awakening has already begun. You cannot unsee what has been seen. You cannot unknow what has been known. But remember this above all, you are not broken, you are not sick, you are not in need of fixing. You are a human soul remembering its own nature, a consciousness expanding beyond the narrow confines in which it has been contained. Trust the process, even when it terrifies you. Trust the dissolution, even when it feels like death. Trust the darkness, for it is in the darkness that new life begins. The world will try to convince you otherwise. It will offer you 1,000 ways to go back to sleep, to return to the comfortable unconsciousness of the masses. But once you have tasted the wine of your own authentic existence, once you have heard the voice of your own truth, you can never again be satisfied with the thin gruel of borrowed opinions and second-hand dreams. You are awakening, not just for yourself, but for all of us. Each person who remembers their true nature makes it easier for others to remember theirs. Each soul that refuses to live a life of quiet desperation becomes a beacon for those still lost in the fog. This is your gift to the world, not your perfection, but your authenticity. Not your certainty, but your willingness to live the questions. Not your arrival, but your courage to keep walking toward home.